alaikum and good afternoon, everyone. My sincere apologies for the delay. We had some technical difficulties and we figured it out. And thank you for the panelists for your patience as well. So my name is Huda Abadi. I am the executive director of our Three Winners Foundation. I want to welcome you all to our special panel on dismantling systems of oppression, building an inclusive America. Not only have we seen the drastic unequal impact of COVID-19 on Black and Brown communities, but we continue to witness dehumanization and state violence on Black lives. We have been absolutely outraged by the violent death of George Floyd and countless others that have been murdered by state-sanctioned violence and anti-Black racism. As we know, this is nothing new and continues to be part of our country's painful legacy of systemic racism and exclusion. As an organization founded to combat hate, bigotry, and racism, we are committed to fostering equitable and inclusive communities where no one should live in fear because of hate. We all have an active role to play in addressing systemic racism and anti-Blackness that goes beyond performative gestures of solidarity and hashtags. This includes holding ourselves accountable by challenging our own socialization and investment in white privilege, addressing anti-Blackness in our very own communities, and having honest and very difficult conversations around race and racial disparity. So in this light, we are incredibly fortunate to have with us two distinguished panelists, Iman Makram al-Amin from Minneapolis and Sister Sabriya Mills from Atlanta, whose work is both firmly rooted in the principles of social and racial justice. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
I would like to first introduce our Sister Sabriya Mills. She is a social advocate and an educator who partners with educators, community leaders, and activists to advocate for inclusive spaces and marginalized voices. After spending nearly a decade working in education and addressing the needs of the nonprofit organization, Sabriya continues to advocate for marginalized individuals across the city of Atlanta. In addition to her advocacy work, she currently works as a journalist for an international publication and owns a podcast called The Dope Muslim Women Podcast. I encourage you to check it out. Her work as a journalist focuses on amplifying the voices and experiences of Black American Muslims. The next person I want to introduce is Iman Makram. He is the Imam of the historical Masjid An-Nur in Minneapolis, Minnesota, one of the fastest growing and most culturally diverse congregations in America. Imam Makram also led in the masjid's numerous community services. He is engaged in peace building at the national and the local levels, from mentoring men transitioning from prison to interfaith dialogue with Bishop Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama. As an advisor to Keith Ellison, the first Muslim elected to Congress, Imam al-Amin has counseled Ellison on religious issues and accompanied him on international trade trips as well. Welcome again, and thank you both for joining us. So I want to start at a very basic level with our viewers. In terms of how would you describe the state of racism in America today, very briefly? Perhaps Sister Sabriya, you can start.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I think anytime we look at racism in this country, we have to look at it in its systemic form and institutionalized form. And when we look at institutionalized racism, we're looking at the practice of social and political institutions that reflect in disparities of in our healthcare system, education, our economy, our access to our economic buying power and criminal justice system. So we really, when you want to really look at institutionalized racism, you want to look at it in three different elements. So you want to look at it in the form of public policies, institutionalized practices, and cultural representation. So how are laws enacted? How is funding funneled into communities of color? How are communities of color policed? How does it show up in the criminal justice system. And when we talk about cultural representations, we talk about how what are their perceptions and viewpoints, and how does media play a role, and how people of color are perceived. So all of this really infuses and permeates into the mindsets and mind frames of the people here in this country, which really sort of fosters an idea of racism on a more institutionalized level.
Absolutely. First of all, I'm honored to be on this panel and participate in today's timely discussion. I fully concur with Sister Sabria and her analysis. I think that is spot on. You know, the only thing I would add to that, I think, in this moment is to say that I think we're in a time right now through varying factors, not the least of which being, you know, the current president of the United States, you know, and who really is a representative of a mindset that has really been legitimized in the eyes of many to spew more, I would say, overt racism, you know, right in your face, that sort of thing, where there was always been this idea that things were, you couldn't see it as readily as it was maybe back in the 30s or the 40s or even in the 60s and things of that nature, because it was just folks calling people out like directly, like, I don't like you, I hate you, whatever. It has become more sophisticated in the sense of becoming institutionalized and so on and so forth, as our sister just beautifully articulated. But now, in recent times, you know, it's as if this ugliness has been given permission to spew into the public again and back into the public discourse, to be just as unashamedly, you know, just right front and center. And that has I think shown itself up into a heightened racial sensitivities and racial tensions. And also has fed into violence, you know, directly violence. So I think that this is also something that is very true in this moment that we're speaking about right now.
Thank you very much to both of you for really breaking it down for us and showing us the various levels also of institutional racism and how it plays out and permeates within our society. Do you think we are at a critical moment or at a critical juncture right now?
You know, absolutely. I think that, you know, and I can only speak from the space of a Black person that has a level of understanding and historical context of what has happened to our people since the institution of slavery, okay? So when we talk about a critical point, absolutely we are, but we've always been at these critical places. It's really just about how we're moving the needle as Black people that are consciously connected to what's happening. And I think one of the first steps is really being conscious and aware. And I think, as our Imam just spoke to, one of the kind of things I appreciate about the Trump era is how overt it actually is. And we lived, you know, there was a time where where racism was all about hiding behind white sheets. Well, now the white sheets are gone. We know exactly what it is. It's very overt. It's right here in our face. And like I said, I appreciate that any day over the white sheets, right? So I think when we're looking at this time, it really is a critical point in time, because now I feel like as a people, we are reawakening our consciousness. It's always been there, but we have certain things that have happened during, I guess, in the time span historically, even I could say, and this may not be a popular opinion, but one of the things I saw even during the Obama era was this complacency that we had because we have a Black president. Now, what happens with complacency is that there may be a level of consciousness that you're not actively working. Well, the people that are really invested in the institutionalized racism in this country because they benefit from it, they're always working, right? You can't be complacent. So the fact that we are now conscious, the fact that things are really in our face, police killings have never stopped. They have never stopped. It's just a bit more in our face now. And what the Trump era has done has really allowed racist mentalities, structural policies all been really heightened and made aware. So this is a critical time for people to be aware, but to really use this awareness to really enact change, and not in a passive way. We have to be a bit more aggressive at this point.
Certainly, I agree wholeheartedly with that. Again, I would also just add that, it's to me, it's also demonstrating, even in this moment of response, that of how profound the privilege is, right? So the idea that, it becomes an issue when a certain segment of society stand up and take notice, right? So this idea of saying that the things that have been said for many, many years and have been often repeated, but met with a lot of resistance because it wasn't as in your face. It wasn't, things weren't captured on video all the time, those sorts of things. But even now we're seeing things can be as plain as day and also on video. And they're essentially telling you, you didn't see what your eyes thought you saw, right? And that's essentially what they're telling people, to dumb down and not recognize, that it wasn't asphyxiation, it was an underlying medical condition that caused his death, right? It's these sorts of things that, this with gaslighting and all these other things that, that folks, that happen all the time, that have sent people into this spin of sorts, to where now all of a sudden in this moment where I've been to several protests, I've been out a lot in my community. Minneapolis has kind of been the epicenter of this latest scenario, and the heightened tension and all of the, my city was literally on fire, right? So the fact that now there are rallies that are across cultural, racial lines, social, economic, all this kind of things. I mean, even when you have, folks like Amazon and the NFL and other folks really acknowledging they were wrong about these issues and they support. I mean, it's like so is now. And so does that make this the watershed moment? Because the institutions now have recognized. I think in this, though, yes, it can be. It can be a moment depending on what follows, what happens afterwards. But even this of itself kind of, meets us with a certain level of angst and really almost visceral. I think a response to this is that now it's that because it is being captured by the establishment now. You know what I mean? And so again, it's mixed feelings about this is happening right now. That's why this issue is so complex. And there's not a clean path forward in terms of how we should respond.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Iman Makram, this question is particularly for you as a faith leader. What would you say is the role of faith institutions in dismantling racism and pushing for policy change? Last week, we have seen how President Trump co-opted the church for a photo op to seek legitimacy with his base. And during the same time, that we were tear gassing peaceful protesters in the process and rubber bullets. Would you say that more needs to be done by religious institutions in addressing this issue?
Certainly, I would. To that particular point that you mentioned about co-opting the church, I was very pleased to see that one of the leaders of the church, the response from the church, the name escapes me right now, but I was in tune with that particularly, and they completely denounced that. Like we were a pawn in this show. This is don't attribute this to them. And I was appreciative of that action. I think that said a lot. Yes, absolutely. We must do more as faith communities. Our role has always been to comfort the afflicted, if you will, right? The idea of coming to aid of those who have been subject to oppressions and hurts and of all forms, sides of that kind of thing. That's always been a role of the faith communities. Likewise, the other side of that was also to afflict the comfortable as well, right? So the idea that we must also be agitators in this situation and be speaking truth to power, which in our faith tradition, as you all know very well, is one of the strongest demonstrations of faith and Iman is to speak, to a powerful, whether it's individual or institution or a government or whatever the it is, right? But to speak truth to that thing, I think that's in the very essence of who we are as faith traditions, and we haven't done enough. I mean, I think that there has been, varying responses that are very curious. You know, I'm very curious. We pick and choose, you know, a lot of the things that we want to kind of go in on. You know, and I think that my assessment is that, quite frankly, we need to do more so that we can be really seen when this is all said and done, that we were on the right side of history here. You know, we weren't complicit, we were on the right side of history.
Are there some examples right now that you see that are taking initiatives in terms of faith institutions, taking more proactive initiatives in speaking truth to power, but also action on the ground?
Certainly.
That
I mean, I think that
communities
yes.
can like emulate, you know?
Sure. I think, you know, a national one is the Poor People's Campaign, like headed by Dr. William Barber down there in Carolina. I mean, I'm a fan of his, and just in terms, I support the work that he practices the sacred practice of truth telling, as he said, right? The idea of that bringing that truth squarely in front of the people without regard of how it's seen or viewed by everybody. I mean, he has a voice in this space, and I think that he's really modeling a way forward. But there are many, too many to really name. I mean, we have, you know, coalitions even here, like on the ground, that are across faith traditions. I mean, the Muslims have a role, but it's a very interfaith space where folks are really, you know, locking arms and saying, no, not here, not on my watch, that sort of thing. So yes, I think there are numerous ones, but from a national perspective, I point to William Barber. In fact, I love his tweets. I mean, they give me life in many respects, right? So he's at the top of my mind in this moment. But that's a national effort that is also just showing that there are many, many efforts. But again, I think that in some ways, folks really are leaning in, but there's another level of in the faith communities that I think are scared to death of people like William Barber, to be honest, and not want and really are complicit in these moments as well. So it's not across the board. I think that you can find spots, you know, where this is really happening. Sure.
Thank you so much. To Sister Sabriya, you know, systems, this is a question for you. Systems of oppression are not isolated, of course, from each other. They intersect in significant ways. Visible Muslims in the West bear the brunt of Islamophobia. Sister Sabriya, you are a visible Black Muslim woman. How do you experience these different identities? And what's the impact of gender on anti-Blackness and Islamophobia?
That's a powerful, multi-layered question.
Absolutely.
But I'm gonna tackle this like this. I'm gonna give my perspective in regards to how I view Islamophobia and you know, institutionalized racism here in this country. And I think even the term of Islamophobia is relatively new here. So we haven't even got to a place where we have really been able to really analytically look at the impact of it. It's really it's a real thing. It's a very relevant thing. However, when I think about structural barriers against me as a woman, it is in the area of racial disparities, what I experience that has been established for 400 and plus years. And the thing about is the one of the critical factors with Islamophobia is there's a visibility component attached to Islamophobia in the sense of, you know, what you wear or your name or some other factors. And now if you disassociate from all of that, you sort of kind of come out of the box and maybe you may not be subject to Islamophobia. I will never take away this Black face. There's nothing I can do about it. And so when I think of how it intersects, I look at it as a Black woman, what I experience, you know, like I said, the structural barriers of my people, what I've seen for disparities in access to education. You know, I work as an educational consultant in marginalized Black communities. And I've also worked in very privileged schools as well. And, you know, to see the disparities there, you know, there's really no comparison, because really when you're talking about children that have barriers against them, where the school to prison pipeline has already been established, when you're coming into a school as a 5-year-old, I mean, there's no real comparison to that. And I have a quick statistic to speak to it. In the United States school system, sorry, I have it here. In the United States school system, only 15% of the United States student enrollment is represented, is Black students, right? But they make up 35% of students suspended once, 44% of students suspended more than once, and 36% of students expelled. It speaks to that you've already criminalized and punished children. And this is what I've seen growing up in Black schools. So when you ask me how it intersects as a Black Muslim woman, I really think I can't put it on the same playing field. So that's first and foremost. Second, I think as Black women, one of the things we have to understand is what role, as far as intergenerational trauma on us as Black women from slavery. We were over-sexualized, our bodies were over-sexualized, we were products of sexual aggression during the times of slavery. That is something that we carry on our backs to this day, trying to constantly be valued in spaces, both Muslim and non-Muslim spaces as Black women. We have to, there was a study put out not long ago that now in America, Black women out-educate or out-degree, I think, almost every other demographic of people. And that just speaks to the rush and the race to be valued, right? To the kind of sense of getting our integrity and sense of self back for ourselves. So when I think about, how I show up as a visible Black Muslim woman, honestly, this visibility actually helps me. It actually helps this Black skin a lot more, actually. I'm treated just a little bit differently. You know what I mean? I'm treated just in a sense of, as Black women, when they show up, there's constantly trying to show that you are, valued, educated, that you deserve a seat at the table. So honestly, when it comes to just showing up as both a visible Muslim and a Black woman, being a Muslim is what has helped inequities and disparities against me, sort of, in society. So that's kind of been my experience.
Sure.
No, thank you very much. I've worked on Islamophobia for many years, so having your voice and bringing also your experience as a Black woman, it's important, and I think honestly is very much needed and absent in a lot of spaces that work on Islamophobia, which we need to pay more attention to as well. This is a little bit linked to the question that I asked Sister Sabriya. Iman Makram, you've also worked on both fighting, racial equity and racial justice, but at the same time worked in spaces of Islamophobia. What would you say are some of the intersections from your perspective as a faith leader, as a Black faith leader, working in both spaces? Yeah. And how would our fight actually, first and foremost, on racial justice inform our second fight towards Islamophobia rather than vice versa?
Yes, I mean, I think, they both, I think, are, branches from the same wicked tree,
Absolutely.
So I think that they find themselves in a space where it's about, discrimination, it's about demonization, and it's about really denying access. I mean, literally, the denying access. So you have these two things that I don't think that are equal. I can carry my sister. I don't see them as equal, right? I mean, for myself, when I walk into a space, I show up as this big Black guy. You know what I mean? And I'm very aware of that. I'm very aware of that, right? And it's not until my bio is read, or I begin to speak, or I say my name and say, oh, this guy's a Muslim, right? So, but my identity doesn't lead with that, right? Because, and it was such a racialized, because that's what they see first, etc. And even the countless times where, that, we've been made to feel, that we needed to shrink, to make people feel more comfortable around us as well, laugh when things are not funny, act when things, all that kind of stuff, right? I mean, these are coping mechanisms that have happened from a real racialized lens. I think that when you think relative to Islamophobia, I think it is something that we are also in that boat as well with everyone else, with all other Muslims. I mean, we hurt when our Muslim brothers and sisters are hurting, but I think that it's really one of those things that is targeted in that space. I challenge people to really look at history as well. The idea that there has always been some religious intolerance and abuse in this country. Whether it was the Catholics or the Jews or whomever, right? And because we're kind of the newest of all of those, are the most recent, now we're getting the brunt of it right now too, and perhaps there'll be someone else after us that will feel this as well. I mean, so it's moved in this way. I'm speaking from a historical context in that way. I would say that these things should be seen as coming from the same root. But again, I would say I wouldn't necessarily count them as equal in this space, though. I wouldn't do that. But I would also say that, you know, looking at the history of race and race relations here and the gains that folks have made, I think that one of the things to inform, you know, the movement against Islamophobia and other things is so that this is for the long haul. And when they really are committed to keeping disparities and keeping this system in place, then they begin to institutionalize it in many ways as well. This is what we've seen. So when African Americans begin to make gains in certain areas, all of a sudden, guess what? We're going to change the rules to the game here too. And, you know, issues like redlining and all, you know, all this kind of things would have happened. So I would just let them understand that this thing comes in waves. I think that this is the learning from one to the next. It comes in waves. I think that we need to necessarily, we need to be marking our measured, I would say, victories in this thing, but don't lose the sense that we're still in a struggle. I really appreciate what our sister talked about during the Obama administration, where there were times and spaces where, you know, it was the language, the rhetoric was as if this didn't really exist, or it was such a major improvement. You know, no, it was underground. It was percolating under the system because we had the cover of something being improved, right? So I would say also we need to be informed by that reality too, right? So I think there are many learnings that we can do, but it really speaks to us honestly being in good communication with one another and having a strategic approach that see each other as equals at the table when we're talking and having real serious discussions about this, because we're both going to be affected. With the African American, the Muslim, are going to be affected in adverse ways, and we need to know that and strengthen each other's struggle.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Absolutely, thank you. Absolutely. I think one of the things in the struggle of Islamophobia is also to be more aware of racial inequity and taking it into the struggle of Islamophobia as well, which
Certainly.
sometimes is missing from those spaces and lacks big time.
Sure.
So one of the things, this is a question for you both. This past week, we have witnessed classical instruments of authoritarian regimes. Some of them include the threatening to use the army on our own people, the use of tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse peaceful demonstrations, co-optation of religious texts to seek support for undemocratic policies, lack of freedom, transparency and accountability from law enforcement, freedom of speech is stifled, and also rise of toxic masculinity. For a long time, if you just take this and without saying what country it is, in a newspaper, they would say it's elsewhere, it's not in the United States, but unfortunately, this is in the United States right now. Yeah. And for centuries, the social contract has been broken. Trust between the state and communities of color is almost barely non-existent. Law enforcement, as you mentioned, as you both mentioned, law enforcement means something different to white people and to Black people. How can we call for an alternative model to produce a more transformative and just state? Some right now say, you know, there needs to be a reform to law enforcement in defunding the police in general, and a particular reform, some say it completely needs to be abolished. What are some of your ideas in terms of an alternative model?
Well, yeah, you're right. The movement is right now on the ground to defund and totally dismantle the police and offer an alternative for the communities. And mashallah, that's a good push. I know that in Minneapolis, there was some movement on that just recently, which I just saw. Our dear sister Asma shared a story this morning, because in fact, the United States spends over $100 billion of policing per year. Yeah. It's a disproportionate amount of overall spending that is funneled into the police, into law enforcement. And I think when you look at it, you have to look at it in many layers. In one way, in many ways, it does need to be completely dismantled, but also you have to look at it, let's look at it at a micro level for a second. First and foremost, stop criminalizing everything. Everything doesn't have to be a crime. For example, in New York, they have over 10,000 crimes, codes, and rules that police can enforce. They can, you know, victimless crimes. What does this enforcing do? it escalates situation that ends up what happened to our brother George Floyd, right?
Absolutely.
So because they've totally have created, and they constantly, year by year, create more and more crimes and more codes to enforce that the police have permission to enforce. And it just leads to, like, the United States is the biggest jailer right now, right? We're talking about the criminal justice system, the institution of and you have to look deeply into who benefits from those jail cells being filled, right? The private institutionalization of our criminal justice system, right? Also, there's, on a micro level, we use poor people to fatten city budgets. For example, traffic violations. We issue bench warrants when poor people can't show up or have issues and barriers. Again, when you go issue that bench warrant, you have another opportunity where police can be escalated, and we could end up again like another situation like our brother George Floyd. The biggest thing, which I find very troubling, which is this program 1033, which is the militarization of the police, the funding that is funneled into militarizing our police systems that are supposed to be, the premise is supposed to be, even though we know that's not the foundation of the police in this country, it was really put in place during the time of slavery to capture slaves.
That's right.
So let's be clear about that. So, but we can go with the protect and serve premise. But we're still militarizing. We're militarizing. There's a program called 1033. Look it up. For instance, the police department of Cottage Grove, Minnesota, right, which is 10 miles south of St. Paul, they got $1.1 million worth of equipment, military equipment, in the first 3 months of this year alone, as if they almost anticipated this happening. We're now in June, right? That included $750,000 of mine-resistant vehicles and tanks, which we're seeing on our streets now. Robots, squad equipment, militarized weapons, right? We have militarized our police system. That gives them a green light to do exactly what they're doing. That's why I have an issue with the whole good cop, bad cop premise, because it's about what was it founded on. So we're looking at it, and again, you have to look at it on a macro level. Yes, does it need to be dismantled? Absolutely. But when you're looking at what's actually been happening, you have to have awareness of it. You're not, an institution is not going to invest millions, and you talk about $1.1 million just for an area in Minnesota. First 3 months of this year, you're talking to millions of dollars of investment. Why? Is there an anticipation of something are we anticipating, or are we agitating something to happen so that we can militarize, officially justify militarizing our Black communities? And I think that that's something that has to be looked and explored at on a deeper level, so that when we're thinking of how we're going to enact change, we're an enlightened people. We're not just kind of coming reactionary and off the backs of just one particular case, that we are looking at this and as systemic as it is, because we have to be equally as systemic. We have to be equally as strategic in our approach. Otherwise, we're going to be in the same place that we've been in the past couple of years.
Thank you, Sister Sabia. You're raising actually excellent points, and also responding to a lot who have been saying, well, there's some really good cops. It's just like few bad cops, few bad apples that we need to get rid of. And this really gives a very good understanding of why we need to move and look beyond the good versus bad cop. Iman Makram?
When they say about just a few bad cops and that sort of thing, we hear that a lot, and I mean, but we never apply that to it's a few bad doctors, a few bad pilots, what I mean? Fly planes.
Yeah, I heard that. We wouldn't want to have.
We got a few bad pilots. What are they? A few was too many. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. So
absolutely.
I think that one of the things that is problematic is that again, that is rhetoric. That's deflection. In terms of, but you can have a good cop. I know good cops. I've gone to school with people who we've grown up who they went into law enforcement. I know these to be good people. I also understand that they're in a machine right now that is built to perpetuate itself as well, right? So it's problematic just from start to finish. In fact, just a little bit of self-disclosure here. I have been a chaplain for the Minneapolis Police Department. I was really brought on to really serve particularly the Muslim population and also Muslim officers, you know what I mean, to provide spiritual care to them and so on. And because again, it's a very high tension job and things of that nature. So I contract to work with them and so on. here's the thing that even I made a decision to even rethink my role in this position in this moment, because the idea is that it's the culture itself that is so prevalent.
Yeah.
It's so prevailing that even those who have the intention of doing the right thing and approaching the right way, they get swept into that culture, right? And I think that's why I'm a proponent for reform, dismantle, whatever the language is. I mean, I actually want to see more details when it comes to these new things that are coming out here. I'm not signing blank checks here either, right? But the idea is to say I need to understand what that means and so on and so forth. But yes, the system currently as it is broken, which I said I have to make a statement and step back from my role, because I need to agitate more now from this, as opposed to providing pastoral care. I need to agitate to say for reform or whatever that actually will look like. So that's one thing. You mentioned Cottage Grove, Minnesota, which is I can tell you that place is not a place. That's not a city that's known for crime. It's not a city that's even known for high levels of minorities in that community, right? So the idea is like, what is this about?
Yeah.
What in the world is this about? I mean, at least it would be like, this area is so inundated with this, that, and the other that we need to have that. I know that place. That's not a place for that, right? So again, this is, first of all, it's wasted resources, and then with the over-militarization. I was on the program with the American Muslims for Palestine recently, and they showed some of the tactics, because many of our police forces are also trained, through
by the IDF.
But by the IDF.
Absolutely, Georgia State.
Exactly. Again, which is a whole nother mind-boggling
university.
Yeah, right. But the tactic that was used to essentially kill George Floyd was a prominent tactic shown and viewed in the IDF's policing, over-policing of the Palestinian citizens. It was exact. I mean, we saw pictures. It was so eerie, right, to figure out. But this is where we send people to train and that sort of thing. So it's not rocket science to see why we're getting the results that we're getting either. And the last thing I'll say here is the other side. I also I do life coaching with those who are coming home from prison. And I'm talking about the other side of the criminal justice system, when you finally are coming back, the brokenness, the disconnect, the stigma, the second class citizenship, the employment, healthcare, housing, education, all these things go to the wayside. All these things are, people are living. So it creates this class system that is so entrenched. I mean, that I'm troubled, deeply troubled, where I'm called to go in and to fix broken men, fix broken, folks who have been, the victims of this overarching system. And it creates a situation to where, when you have social workers, probation officers, and a whole nother industry where their job is to keep tabs on lives of people who have been broken by the system, right? I mean, so again, it's a perpetual thing that happened all over. So I think from A to Z, we need to revisit this whole idea of what it means for law enforcement in this country, as it is also law enforcement, as Sister was just saying very clearly, gives its life or its birth from overseers in the slave trade, in the slave practice, and it's grown into this big institution that is keeping folks marginalized, is keeping folks suppressed, and it is just wreaking havoc on the lives of too many Black people in this country.
Absolutely.
Thank you
Absolutely.
both. Because it's just an hour and a half, I want to move on a little bit to the panel, to some solutions that the viewers at least can say, we'll take it with us and change. I want us to focus on how can we build more towards inclusivity and work towards more racial equity. Sister Sabriya, this is a question for you. It's a two-part question. Humans are natural storytellers. Our stories gives us hope, offers solution, inspires action. It absolutely inspires young people when they see representation and see people that look like them in the media. It's a very powerful message that it sends. As a journalist, how do you frame and elevate stories of Black experiences to ensure that these messages get across to young, aspiring Black journalists? What would the advice be?
Yeah, You know, that's a tough one because, you know, when I look at, you know, one of the reasons I became a journalist is like, that's kind of like, I always call myself a half-baked journalist because that's not how I started my career. But one of the reasons why I became a journalist is because it's such a critical strategy that has been utilized by any oppressor that wants to oppress a group of people. They use
Absolutely.
strategies of propaganda. They use media. I mean, look at how Hitler was so effective. I mean, that was one of his primary strategies and tools. The impact of media and why media is so heavily controlled in this country. And even as a journal, like I always say, you know, kind of support independent journalists. But there's really no such thing, to be honest with you, if you want a real platform. So even though I may work for, you know, different Muslim publications and such, I have to fight extremely hard to amplify the stories of Black people and Black experiences. You know why? Because it's always not pretty. It doesn't look pretty and cushy. And sometimes I think even, and I'm just going to speak to the Muslim space for a second, a lot of times I think one of the things we do that can be pretty harmful, it diminishes the experiences of a people, is that we focus a lot on our image and, you know, okay, we have to appear like Muslims are really great. We don't have these problems. It's this area of peace, which that's all true. But we also cannot diminish the experience of a group of people. You know, we're here on this country on the backs of on the backs of slaves, right? On the backs of Black people, right? The structural barriers against Black people in this country is what keeps this country running. You know, so those stories have to be amplified. And so for me personally, the importance of media is so critical. And I have a very radical viewpoint on this. I feel like every organization at this point in history, every misogynist should invest in hiring a journalist, an independent journalist that's going to report on the news and what's happening on the ground. Because when this happened to me, to be honest, I received calls from all kinds of communities. It was too much of an unknown. It was too much of an unaware of what has been happening. And it's because we're allowing our minds to be impacted and changed by mainstream media. And even if you want to think you're getting alternative media, believe me, they're being controlled. Hire your own journalists, investigate your own stories. And this is not public relations people. These are people that are actually reporting the news, amplifying the stories that are relevant to the Muslim communities, the Black community. We were supposed to be on the front lines as Muslims of justice. How are we going to do that if we are completely unaware and we are comfortable in our homes and just going to Juma on Fridays and we don't know that there's a group of people that are being brutalized, oppressed, and killed and marginalized right down the street from us? So I really believe that right now, I really implore for masjid leaders to make areas in your budget, organizational leaders to make areas in your budget where you are actually hiring media correspondent, people that you train from yourself, and allow them to actually create a new format of media, because it is a strategy, okay? It is a strategy that is utilizing its very, very successful strategy that helps elevate, empower the mindsets of the people that you either want to control or, you know, uplift and empower.
And what would you say, I mean, the second part of the questions, you spoke a lot about like producing media, which is absolutely, I'm also a fan. As a major in communication myself, I definitely believe in radical and alternative media platforms to elevate voices of minorities in general. Representation really matters. But as consumers of media, to people watching who are consuming media, how can we influence mainstream media content and practices, like to push them in terms of thinking on the way that they represent particular groups of people and to be less biased against Black and Brown communities in general?
Yeah.
Do you have like any ideas?
Yeah, sure. We began funding and flooding our people into the media, like as journalists. We began flooding it. I think it's really counterproductive to spend a lot of time wasting and try to figure out how a system that's been really tactical and created as a form of propaganda. Instead, create your alternative forums.
There you go.
Be strategic, uplift and empower. And actually what's happening now, during the time of September 11th, it's interesting. Why I have an appreciation of how sometimes freedom of speech right now is kind of it's just a little buck wild right now, right? What we can print. But I appreciate it as a journalist, because during the time of like when September 11th happened, we really, you know, if I printed something about maybe exposing something that was happening on a governmental level, I might get a visit from or a phone call from the federal government. That was really happening.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So now I have an appreciation, although it allows people to really just kind of be biased and exposed, it also allows like radical change and to uplift the truth, right? It also allows us to not be as sanctioned. So, but it is on the community to understand the importance of media, to invest in it, to encourage your children, even if it's as a side gig, to really uplift and empower these stories that matter, and to work against the bias by creating alternative formats.
Yeah. And I would say that there are now a lot of organizations, hopefully I can share a resource of funding young, you know, young leaders, young youth to produce their own media coming from, you know, different groups, different communities of color. I think it's absolutely very much needed. Which leads me to, you mentioned, Sister Sabriya, you mentioned freedom of speech. It leads me to my next question very nicely. This past week, we have seen the President of the United States use actually very racist and violent language to describe the protesters. He called them thugs, threatened to use the military, and tweeted, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts," end of quote. So how do we encourage the responsible use of freedom of speech and hold at the same time accountable those outlets that promote xenophobia and hate speech? You can see Twitter had a stance, Facebook no. What role, if any, should the government have in holding the media accountable for hate speech or sentiments that really incite discrimination and also violence?
Sure. You know, if I mentioned that, you know, it's one of those things to where, you know, if you look at the origins of this freedom of speech, it was designed so that folks who are being oppressed wouldn't be stifled, they wouldn't be silenced, right? Exactly. It wasn't a license to say anything, anyway, anyhow. That was never the design of freedom of speech. That was not designed for what it was. It was a tool of liberation, of upliftment, and a path forward. But again, it was always, as I understand it, to be something that's supposed to be used with integrity as well, right? So that you know, you can't dog, you know, it was a dog whistle, you know, says these buzzwords, which basically devalues. Look, if you look at me as, and you call me a thug versus you calling me a father or a son or a brother, you know what I mean? If you the thug, that basically gives license to the establishment to treat me in a certain fashion. That allows them to dehumanize me from a human being, essentially, to just that to that object over there. So the idea, I mean, just like, it's like calling, you know, even at war, you know, we'll call, I mean, men, women, and children who may be resisting, you know, tanks being in their country, we'll call them insurgents. You know what I mean? We won't call them, you know, mothers and children and all, because if I say, you know, we're gonna open fire on these mothers, and we say, whoa, we can't do that kind of thing. But if I call them insurgents, we got to go ahead at them. You know what I mean? So this has been language that has always done. Even in the African American community, even things like thug and that language, that's has always been a part of the thing, and we had to resist these. I mean, so much so that it's been like a counter movement to actually just embrace it and then just turn it, basically. You know what I mean? So the idea, we've been using this to say, and embrace this idea to say that I will be that scary thing that you think if you continue to mistreat me and in this kind of a way, right? But it's licensed, basically. That's what this is. It's licensed. He's communicating with those who think like him and those who have the authority to do certain things. It's by, you know, it's a sophisticated way of just continuing your oppression, and it's just waving a flag that is now it's time. Now it's time, basically. You know, the governor of Minnesota, we were on a call with him a couple of days ago when he was enacting the National Guard. And he said he was on the phone with the president the day before, which was not a good phone call per his instruction to us, and basically saying that, look, if you don't get this under control, we're coming in, I'm bringing military, all that kind of stuff, which he has no authority to do that kind of stuff. But again, the idea was that like, if you don't do it, I'm going to do it, because, you know, these thugs, these looters, these whatever, but never gave the emphasis, never spoke you know, in a separate conversation with the family of George Floyd, a very quick conversation. His brother said he couldn't get a word in edgewise. And when he finally was able to speak, the only time he had left to speak to the president of the United States, who was calling him to console him for what happened, was to say, the only thing he could muster was, I want justice for my brother. There wasn't an exchange. So this idea, he knows how to use communication and whatnot, is used in ways that effectively minimize in certain places, but also to signal it's time for oppression, you know what I mean, that way. So I think he's masterful in that. If I can say he's good at something, the president is very good with using language that can stoke, you know, fear, and also to signal it's time. He's very good at doing that, and it's something that people have been duped time and time again with his methodology.
Absolutely. I mean, we have seen, according to Southern Poverty Law Center as well, like a complete rise of white supremacy groups.
Certainly.
And giving a licensing to these very violent extremist groups right now that feel that they are free to roam and say whatever they want under the banner of freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech,
yeah, exactly.
No, I mean, I think he summed it up really good. I mean, I don't have the most politically correct answer, but again, I'm going to say that I have appreciation for it. I don't remember a time when we weren't called thugs. I don't know, Iman, do you remember a time when we weren't called thugs? So, I mean, I have an appreciation for you saying it loud, clear, and in exposing the rest of the people that are living in my neighborhoods that I associate with, that I invest my funding in, that you expose them. Thank you. So that's my sort of stance on it. Not that I don't acknowledge and understand the, on the micro level, that the impact that it has to people individually. So I don't mean to diminish that, but if you're looking at it in a sense of being able to identify exactly what we're dealing with, Trump has done a phenomenal job in giving us a good scope of that. And I would be, you know, based on what I'm seeing and what you can't tell me as far as rise of hate groups, that these hate groups weren't there, just waiting to be enacted, right? That this mindset, these mind frames is just a new thing because Trump, it's always been there, you know? And so I think it's really important for us to identify and know exactly, like when I see the Trump banners on the cars and on the, in my neighbor's yards, and you know, there's a level of appreciation for knowing exactly where people stand and where they are, opposed to not knowing. But again, that's speaking like just on the scope of maybe like journalism and things like that.
Sure. Great
I'm
point,
going to push you a little bit, Sister Sabria. I absolutely agree with you in terms of, you know, knowing where we are and being, you know, unmasking the evil that we're trying to deal with. I think it's absolutely great. I would rather know what is in front of us rather than it being white supremacy groups, you know, have been undercover for a long time, and now they just went, you know, they're more upfront about their activities. But thinking like in the future for our kids and for our young people in general, what do you think are kind of like the impact of hate speech and the impact of calling thugs or terrorists or on the psyche and the internal, you know, like the self-esteem of our young people moving forward and trying to build an inclusive America?
For sure. It definitely has an impact. That's why I said on a micro level, I don't want to diminish that. So it has to be dismantled. It has to be fought against. We have to have these organizations that are working really hard to, like I said, expose it on a media level. We have to work really hard to, you know, sort of put out stories that sort of counteract that. But one of the things I'm really delicate about, especially during these times, is really telling those that are oppressing, as an oppressed person, telling you how to stop oppressing, right? Absolutely. I can only, as an oppressed person, identify what has happened to my people, work very hard with my people, clean up our own house, and identify the tools to empower and uplift my children, right? To understand where they give them tools and strategies in order to empower them. Yes, we need to work to dismantle and get rid of all of that on a major level. But I'm just very hesitant with that at this point in time, because I think we've been asked that a lot of like in various different ways of sort of how we didn't create this, right? We're the victims of it. So us figuring out the strategies and the tools for people that hate us to stop. You know, I think Malcolm X said it said it well, like it's like the sheep asking the wolf. It's like, you know, and then it speaks to accountability. I think it's for those that are accountable and conscious within those communities that benefit from white privilege, that benefit from sort of this rhetoric and such, whether you are white or, you know, and other different demographics of people. It's really important that we begin to look at our own house and figure out how we're going to fight against that as well. As Black people, we really have to focus on, like I said, our children, we really have to focus on that. It's very serious right now. The trauma, we see it as we see them in the streets, right? That's our right now. We can have these conversations a bit when we reel them in, but right now I just am cautious with those type, you know, kind of give an analysis on that, because my focus is really how can I impact change with my people right now that are hurting.
I think that is a very powerful statement of what you're saying. I think that is so true, you know, and I would also say from an African-American Muslim perspective too, I think that, you know, there's never just been one America. There's never been one America. I mean, there's been multiple Americas depending on how you show up in the space. You know what I mean? So the idea for us to think that way, I think that's one of the biggest fallacies that I've seen perpetrated in this idea of this huge melting pot. That's never been it. It's never been it. In fact, that's almost, you know, that's propaganda in and of itself, right? So it's kind of smoke screeny over here to really keep you from what the reality is on the ground. I think the idea, even as I speak as an African-American Muslim, you know, I think that there's an opportunity here, but it also is going to take some deep work, right? I think that in Islam, I think we do have a way forward. I think we do have a path forward that's authentically intrinsic into the nature of Islam, but it also calls for us to be better to ourselves within Islam, right? So the idea that we have to work to uproot these things that are really being, in many cases, we have different demographics of Muslims that have benefited from the system. They've benefited from white supremacy in terms of their proximity to it, right? And some have been bad actors, you know what I mean, in terms of not really helping providing that liberation of Islam, but they have actually co-opted it and become many oppressors in themselves, right? It's a situation like, for example, with George Floyd. Let's bring it home, right? George Floyd. The police call that came from to bring the police in and that to incite that engagement came from an Arab-owned Muslim store in the community that has had a jaded relationship with the community that it existed anyways, right? Over $20, over a supposed $20. So he essentially lost his life over a $20 counterfeit bill, quote unquote, right? But really, if you look at that's how people will try to snapshot the moment, but they won't really paint the picture of what was going on for the last 25 years of their presence in that community, right? So the idea of, that's also part of this story. So here we are at the intersection now that I'm a Muslim, but I'm an African American. That was already demonstrated. When I show up, you know how I show up first, right? So the idea, but we've always been called in by the same ones who have been bad actors when things have gone awry to borrow of our social capital to help straighten and remedy things out as well too. It's a mind-taxing situation to be asked to provide cover for something that is really working to disrupt the community in which you belong. You know what I mean? So we have these things. So is there a remedy? Certainly it is. Certainly, if we approach it sincerely, we can model that. And I concur with our sister. This method, that's such a huge term. That's such a huge term that while I understand why it's used, and I think it's not, but it's such a huge term to put on the psyche of people who have been the subject of it. I mean, it's almost unbearable weight. It's almost an unbearable way to undo this kind of thing when, again, as she said very eloquently, we didn't create this. We didn't create this. I think we can be part of creating an alternative to this, but that also means we got to clean our house up to do it, because I'm not without faith or the realization that there's a path forward. I believe it is. What I'm challenged is it the will to do? Is there the will to do it? Not is there a path? If there is a path, is there the will to do? And I think that's really where the conversation has to begin for me in many spaces.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. And just to make sure to clarify, in terms of the hate speech, it's not, the onus is not on the oppressed. I'm referring mostly on government, like taking accountability of allowing hate speech. Should the government take accountability or not? If we look at Germany, for example, and its history, it has clear laws on what it can and cannot say, where there is freedom of speech, but there is respect. There is a freedom of speech with a square of what is not freedom of speech, and it becomes hate speech or not, to be able to move forward and to heal the nation. I actually wanted to speak to you. One of the discouraging factors of structural racism is the way it's able to adapt and the way it is resilient. The powerful interests that permit structural racism to endure are dynamic and they shift with time. Sister Sabriya, you mentioned this earlier. While progress can be made on one policy front, there's another backlash that it can be more subtle and sometimes less direct way. It develops in a less direct way. We have seen this from slavery, then to Jim Crow, then to war on drugs, and then the mass incarceration. And now everyone's like, we're colorblind, we don't see color. How do we stay vigilant and hold those in power accountable? And again, with all the understanding that it's not on the people who are going through the suffering to provide the solutions, but to ensure racial equity with where it's a priority objective, that anyone who is committed to promoting social, economic, and political justice, that racial justice is on the top priority of every organization, programming, masajid, churches, synagogues, etc.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think personally that it definitely starts with having some type of scope of historical awareness. I think is really important because you have to really understand how systemic it is before you can attack and hold, you said, powers to be accountable. So it's really important to understand what is the premise of a lot of these institutions that have been established in this country. And then you have to kind of sort of work to circumvent that. As Muslims, I think it's extremely important, and I just don't want to forget this because I think it should always be at the forefront. Is before we even talk about being vigilant and holding those accountable, we have to be people that are extremely spiritual grounded, right? Because what happens in these movements, a lot of things happen, right? A lot of things happen with your reactions and your emotions, and it's such a heavy load. Like you said, just like our Imam said, dismantle. I mean, subhanallah, like, right? I'm literally trying to get my beautiful Black daughter to realize that she's beautiful. Like it's on that micro level. I'm trying to navigate a traumatized relationship with our Black men from that has come from systemic, from the products of slavery, right? On that micro level, to be honest with you. So being spiritually grounded as Muslims is extremely important and allows us to use those Islamic principles and those spiritual principles because there's a guide there, right? The stories of the Prophet Muhammad, it's all about justice, right? The strategies are there. We actually don't need to really recreate anything. But we do need to continue to hold individuals and structural institutions accountable. And I think you have to, I keep emphasizing, but you have to stay constantly aware. You have to know what laws are being put on the books, where's your funding and your taxes being funneled to, who's being put in office, who's funding these people being put in office. You just have to be unfortunately, just in a time where we have to be a really conscious and aware group of people if we want to really push the needle on this. So we talk about the influence of media, but even how we spend our time, we really have to make sure that we get back to reading and using our tools like social media as a way to educate and empower us. And I think also just continuing to address power and privilege in community and larger systems, right? You have to really, again, there's a lack sometimes of awareness and a lack of accountability. So when there's a lack of accountability, which what I spoke to, you can shoulder it off on another group of people. Like, okay, you feel this way. So all right, tell us how to fix it and we'll go ahead and appease you. And it's like, no. Right? You have to, it's okay for us to help you identify it if there's a lack of awareness, but then the fixing of it and identifying the strategies, it really, the onus is on those that are benefiting from it and are the creators of this institutionalized racism in this country.
Yeah, yeah. Excellent point. Excellent point.
Thank you. Iman Makram, do you want to add anything?
You know, it's so many thoughts in my mind, and in this moment, you know, I think one of the things too, and I just began to think more solution level. I think that that we can model meet with the Muslim community, right? I think that we are in position to model a way forward. Yeah, I think we have again the blueprint, the outline within our tradition to do this. I think that we need to have some serious conversations among ourselves relative to anti-Blackness within the Muslim community. I think we need to really go there. I think that we need to have a serious strategic investment within African American and Black Muslim-led institutions. I think that there's an investment there to be a supporter of this and not see yourself on the sideline. I'm challenged sometimes by the language ally. I'm challenged by that language just because—
That was my next question.
Me
Absolutely.
too.
Go ahead.
I'm challenged by that language because it almost suggests, while I think it's well-intended, I'm challenged by that because what it does is it seems to suggest that this doesn't affect me. This is about you. So I'm actually doing you a favor to kind of lean in here, right? You know what I mean? That sort of thing is, as opposed to taking ownership and saying, you know what, it's better for all of us collectively that we support—
human rights issue.
Exactly. It's one of those things too. So I'm challenged even by language and how we use that language and how it just puts people in certain boxes and really it helped them abdicate responsibility to act in a fashion that— because they don't see their self with myself. It's like, you're there, I'm here. So there's no joining in this moment. You know, I'm over here, I'm gonna do you a favor. You guys got me some issues over here. Let me lean in for this moment. I'll come to this rally. I'll throw some money at the issue, but it's not really my issue, it's your issue. You know, and I think that is where we're finding real challenge and where it makes it, quite frankly, difficult on the ground to really gain traction, even in Muslim circles. In Muslim circles, I think that's one of the most challenging things. Being an African-American Muslim leader in this city, in my position for the last 25 years, I've seen this play itself out over and over and over again. And I'm saying at some point in time, we got to stop. We got to take a time out. We got to reprogram or have a paradigm shift to say, when my community does do better, we're all better, right? And likewise, right? And I think that until we do that, and language is so important. You guys are scholars, you know this, right? Language is so important in terms of how you frame things, how you approach things. And I'm just saying, we're starting to see diminishing returns with language like ally in this space as well. So I'll leave it at that. So
I know that was a part of your question. Is it okay? Do you want to just ask the question? Because I want to add on to that just a really small piece. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Also, I agree with you 1,000%, Imam. And I even, like, you know, I've read a lot of different solidarity statements, and mashallah, like I said, the intention and everything, mashallah, it's coming from a very pure place, inshallah.
Yeah.
But even the language in a lot of them is making it about strictly white supremacy. And what the issue, and I think why, and I'm talking a lot of Black circles, why we find it a bit dismissive is because we have to address the anti-Blackness that permeates within our own communities. If we all equally, us, African Americans, other communities, are not equally analyzing the way we approach anti-Blackness, so how it affects us, how it shows up, then essentially what good is it fighting against white supremacy, right?
Exactly.
We're still gonna have, I mean, you know, think about our Islamic texts. I speak to this all the time. It's only in recent years that I identified Black people during the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That was intentional silencing by us, by Muslims done, right? You know, the historical principle, you used to mention representation, sister. Seeing ourselves in our own sunnah. Do you know what that did to us, even like trying to navigate and fill a place in our faith as people that are navigating our own trauma and not even knowing if we existed during the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's outside of Bilal. I mean, so it's really important that we address it. And I just wanted to just add that on. Sorry.
Phenomenal.
Absolutely.
Phenomenal.
I mean, that's my next question. I have two. Thank you very much for both, for you know, word choice matters, and it matters deeply. The way we frame issues matters deeply, and it depends on the way we frame it, the type of answers we're gonna
Right.
try to seek. Like you said, you know, right, when it's a white and black matter, then it's, well, it's, you know, a black issue and we're just gonna be an ally. But when you see it from a human rights issue, and as a human, for our humanity, it's an issue that you know, affects all of us, then we see it from a different lens. But I had two questions until we find a better word of ally. I'll talk about white community, but brown community, and I will start with the brown community because that's the one I'm from. A lot of times we see anti-Blackness, racism from our brown immigrant communities, and many times it goes very much unchecked. Whiteness, you know, seen in the brown communities in the US, and even, you know, in North Africa, where I am from, is associated with what is beautiful, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of times it comes from our colonial history that we bring into the United States. And we have picked it up. And we cannot address these issues, right, and try to move forward without really, you know, calling it out the way it is, and at the same time taking an intersectional and a really holistic approach to try to you know, raise awareness, but also have concrete steps in terms of how we're going to be dealing with anti-Blackness in our own communities. One of the things that both of you mentioned is even within our religious tradition, right? A lot of times, even within our religious tradition, the stories that we say in our, you know, in our mosques, sometimes we silence other stories. What other, I mean, can you talk a little bit about this issue and what it means also as, for you both as leaders, community leaders, trying to, how can we build trust and coalitions with different brown communities moving forward on this particular issue?
Iman, you can.
I mean, I think there are many ways. I think there's some of the a couple concrete things. I think is first that we need to squarely have these conversations up front and with the level of candor and sincerity to begin to create awareness, but also it just builds the trust, you know, that we're able to have these spaces where we can actually have this among us. I think that's one thing. And coupled with, not necessarily after, but coupled with that, again, I go back to serious investment within the Black African-American Muslim-led institutions. I mean, it has to happen. You know, I mean, listen, we're not saying that our brothers and sisters who come here from other places, you didn't cause white supremacy. You're not the author of it or the architect of it. But if we're honest about it, you benefit from it, though, right? You benefit from it in many ways, just in terms of proximity, just, you know, everything, the legislation that was passed through the civil rights movement that allowed more people to come and so on. So if we can all nod and say yes, well then let's then, as our religion tells us, let us, you know, show gratitude and appreciation for those who still, after all that's still said and done, the spectrum of the totem pole still has some certain people trending upward and some people trending down, though you have, you know, certain aberrations every now and again going the other direction, right? But I think, but by and large, those things are still standing true. So I think if we're in conversation with us, so we can get in touch with the human side of each other, but also serious, tangible investment in these communities, especially when you have benefited so much from the structure that has been very, very oppressive. I think those are two distinct things that can happen. And again, that's not even an issue of, that's not waiting for some policy to be erected or some other, that's about will to do. That's about will to do. So that doesn't, we don't have to elect another president for that to happen. You know what I mean? Or even a mayor for that to matter. That's just us coming together and saying, we're committed to this, let's make this happen. You know what I mean? So, but empty words, we're in a space now that words without action is complicit. You know, words without action is complicit. So, I mean, and again, that's how many African Americans are really hearing and actually watching in this moment. It's okay, it's cool at the rally, but when it's time to put for the brass tacks, who's actually leaning in and actually, that's where we're going to see, okay, I mean, so this is more of the same. or this is a different moment. You mentioned, is this a different moment? We're waiting to see. We're waiting to see how different this moment is, because we had this, you know, we've had moments like this before where seemingly watershed opened things up and so on, but things kind of went back to what they were, you know. So I would say that.
Yeah, and yeah, go ahead, Sister Sabri.
No, I mean, I'm just gonna, you know, pretty much second what the Imam said. I don't have a lot to contribute, but I do know in spaces that I mitigate in amongst Black people, you know, one of the things that we would like to see, like I said, is that accountability piece.
Yeah.
We you know, the Black-white issues long term, we're dealing with that. But I think when we talk about, you know, connecting back with our Muslim community, there's a bit of accountability and sisterhood. I really wanted to say I appreciate you for that question and the way that you framed it. And I think we need to see more of that. And would love to see more discussions amongst each other. I have great friends in Indo-Black community and Arab community that are really just working on their community. They're not even like polling Black, they're not even making it a Black issue right now, right? Or trying to see how Black people feel. They're really just taking that accountability and dealing with their own. And I think that is the sentiment I've heard over and over from Black people in terms of feeling a little bit better about these solidarity statements in the term of ally.
Absolutely, thank you. And you said the term very important, which is accountability. And we have to even look back and say, you know, slavery existed even within Africa, within the North Africans, within the Arabs, and what we have seen in Libya, right, you know, in the last few months, something that we should not turn a blind eye to, where right now in 2020, we can still see this live slavery, unfortunately. We don't have a lot of time, and there's some questions. Before, I just wanted to ask one last question, and then we can, a lot of the viewers asked how they can follow you via social media. So if you can provide that very quickly, that would be great.
Let me start. Okay, sure. So I am Sabria Mills, just like my name. You can find me on Instagram and or Facebook. Facebook probably is a better outlet for me. My platform is the Dope Muslim Woman podcast. That can also be found on both Facebook and Instagram, inshallah. And I work for About Islam. You can look at some of the articles. I do try to amplify stories of people of color. You can go on there, put in About Islam, Sabria Mills, so you can see some of my pieces as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So and likewise, my on Instagram is my name spelled out, all lowercase, no spaces, no dashes, anything like that on Instagram. And then my full name, Makram El-Amin. Also have a public page as well for Facebook as well. And then on Twitter is at my last name El-Amin and M-A, the first two letters of my last name, is on Twitter as well. I can also post a couple websites in the chat group as well, you know, as far
that
as
would be great.
To look up some of the work that we do, both from the message side of things, but also El Ma'un, which is our community outreach, some of the stuff we're doing on the ground here in Minneapolis as well. So I'll put that in the chat as well.
Absolutely, Sister Sabria as well. I mean, a lot of times we need to move beyond solidarity statements also and hashtags. So one of the things is to actually support organizations that work on this matter. So if you have any organizations, please put them, also write them in the chat box so they can support them directly. That would be absolutely helpful. Before we ask the last question, I wanted to see also if you had something, either one of you had something that wanted to add that was not asked, and it's important and you want the viewers to know.
And I think we spoke to mostly everything, but I think, like, you know, I just want to push this notion of, you know, after we, mashallah, gain some awareness and perspective from members and leaders from our Black community, that we then sort of take a pause and allow Black people at this time to really mitigate and navigate what's really happening to our community, and really begin to develop programs and coalitions and support within your community to really make sure that it permeates that support without necessarily, even though, like I said, at this stage is necessary, but as we move forward, I think we don't want to constantly pull our Black leaders, because then it takes the scope and attention away from kind of what's happening on the ground.
Absolutely.
So just keeping that into perspective and making sure that the leaders that exist within our other non-Black communities, that they're risen and put up to the front and being at the forefront of doing the things that matter long term.
Thank you.
And we're
so
always
much.
there as a support, you know, it's always counsel and support, inshallah.
Thank you. Iman Makram?
You know, I mean, I would say that, you know, I'm a firm believer that we have enough within the Muslim community, particularly, to provide a pathway forward, you know, and I think that was from the divine wisdom of God to do that on our behalf, to make that happen. I think it's not really about how to do it. I just emphasize it's about will to do, in my view. This idea of us, you know, just making up our minds that we're gonna live to the best ideals of our tradition, and that we're gonna see each other as equals at the table, and we're gonna treat each other with the humanity that God really obligates us to do, and then more specifically, we're gonna look at those who need help. And just very similar to the Ansars and the Muhajirs and the series of the stories of the Prophet ﷺ. And there's so many beautiful things there that, again, I concur with my sister. We don't have to really reinvent the wheel. We just have to live it. We just have to be it, you know. And I'm willing to join forces with anyone, you know, Black, brown community, whomever, right? And that is willing to live into that ideal, right? If we're going to live into that, then we can have a coalition like this world has not seen, perhaps, right? And I think that I think it's necessary, but I also think it's doable. We're not talking about something that is this, you know, just simply hyperbole. You know what I mean? This is something that is doable, right? So it's about the will to do, and you have in us, you know, willingness on our end. So,
Alhamdulillah.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you so much.
Well said.
My last question, leaving on this note, because it must be like, you know, as community activists to deal with this, I feel like it's a continuous trauma sometimes and re-trauma. How do you take the healing and restorative, transformative justice into the spaces of social and racial activism, but take time to take care of yourselves first and foremost? To not burn out and to take care of yourselves. It's something that in a lot of activists
I'll let my sister respond to that.
Yes.
I was about to say, you might be asking the wrong people, but no.
Exactly.
No, mashallah, subhanallah. I'm going to go back to something I said earlier because it needs to be reiterated. And I thank you, Iman, for reiterating. I thank you, Sister Huda, for reiterating it. How we restore ourselves is through our spiritual practices, right? Our spiritual practices is what ground us. Our spiritual practices what renews us. Our spiritual practices, our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, us getting up at night and making those prayers. We wake up and you wouldn't believe how energized we are to get back on the streets, okay? SubhanAllah, there's no other yoga, there's no other, you know, self-care tactic. I promise you, and I'm not trying to be, you know, but there really isn't anything better significant than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already prescribed. So I just implore, now is the time, people. Like tahajjud needs to be like encouraged for every community right now, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ever near, right? During the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when they came to the battle of Badr and all, you know, all the soldiers there who came to help, the angels came to fight behind the believers. So we believe in that, and that's how they were grounded. We talk about trauma. Yeah, we navigate that trauma, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can elevate us if we commit to what He has given us as a prescription. So that's all I got.
Wonderful. There's nothing more. There's nothing more.
Then you can't say anything after this.
Nothing more. No.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Really, thank you so much for stimulating conversation and for sharing your expertise and your experiences with us. I hope we all take this opportunity, to reflect on what was being said, to make changes, to be honest and accountable within our own communities as well. and to be advocates for transformative and social change. Thank you so much.
And can I say
And
one
this is
thing
just
to
the,
you?
absolutely, please go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to say, mashallah, may Allah bless you for your leadership. May Allah bless you for asking beautiful, balanced questions. May Allah increase the organization 3 Winners, because mashallah, that the story of Dia and what happened during that time was, it impacted me so much, subhanallah. And I'm glad that they're, mashallah, the barakah of their lives right now to actually continue to empower and uplift other oppressed people. May Allah enlighten their grave and bless them, inshallah, in Jannah Firdaus, and without any reckoning, as their products and their barakah is still building right now. So may Allah reward you and your organization. And Iman, thank you so much for lighting fire to the conversation.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. Thank you as well. All right.
This is just the beginning, inshallah, of many conversations our 3 Winners will be having on this issue. Thank you so much again.
Absolutely. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody.
Thank you. Peace be upon you. Assalamu alaikum.